Good morning, everyone. My name is Margarita White with the Community Foundation of Noble County, and you are in our nonprofit organization series with it covers budgets and financials. And today we're going to be talking about sustainability. This is workshops in partnership with Crossroads United Way and the DECO Foundation. And if you have a question for today in today's session, you can use the chat or raise your hand, and then we will share your question with our speakers. I think if anything else, the next series is going to start next month on October 14th, and we're going to be covering grant writing. So you'll want to get registered for that if you're not already registered. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Brad and Tom. So Brad, there you go.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to start by sharing my screen just to make sure I get off and running correctly that way. Are we good, Margarita?
I can see it.
Wonderful.
Yes.
All righty. Hey, it's great to see you this morning. We really appreciate you continuing to participate in our three-part series here on nonprofit budget and finance series. I want to reiterate Margarita's comment about questions. Please chime in at any time. If we love to just have you pause, jump right in and ask those questions as they happen, because that's probably where the real good conversations will take place based on those questions. So we encourage you to do so. It's great to have you here this morning. As we talked about financial statements in July, developing an annual budget in September, and then in August, and then today we're going to talk about sustainability. So we hope you continue to find these workshops beneficial. So as far as our agenda for today, we'll try to start off by reconnecting with some of our previous conversations. And then we're going to ask the sustainability question and all that's involved with that. Talk about ways that we can promote sustainability in our organizations, share a couple of case studies examples, and then as always, hopefully leave time for questions that you might have in the end there. So I will turn it over to Tom Leedy. As you remember, I'm Brad Graydon with the Community Foundation of Noble County, and I'll turn it over to Tom to reconnect with what you guys talked about in the August session.
Hey, thank you, Brad. Your slides are not advancing on my computer. I'm still on the opening page.
Is everybody else experiencing the same thing?
Yes.
Interesting.
Brad.
And I'd like to move forward, but I need that page to work off of because I don't
Listen
have
to you.
a hard copy in front of me.
Is that
There
anything
we
now?
go. Yeah, now I've got it. Thank you very much.
Well, we'll see what the next slide looks like.
Okay, yeah, we'll work with it. I probably should have had a copy for myself here too. So good morning, everybody. It's good to see you again. And as Brad said, just to connect from our last session, we talked about budgets and cash flow statements and how they're forward thinking and predictive tools. And that budgeting focuses on predicting the amount of inflow and outflow of your financial assets, and cash flow predicts the timing of those cash inflows and outflows. And then we also talked about how budget and cash flow statements are used, the benefit they provide, and the format will change as your organization matures and changes in its life cycle as well. And works towards solidifying its financial resources, revenue streams. We also, if you go to the next slide.
Did it advance?
Mine did not.
Man, oh man. Margarita, do you have the slides?
Absolutely. Let me pull them up.
Let's call an audible here. Believe me, it's working on my screen.
It's technology.
What
Hey, and
number
this
is
is what
that, Brad?
We're on about 60 now. Yep, slide 60.
This is what you get when you have both of us together.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but obviously, we have a little, we need to work on our ability to work together here.
How's that?
All right. Perfect. Thank you, Margarita. So when we talked about budgeting, we talked about it being a process that allows you to tell your organization's annual story in dollars and cents. And there are two components to it, the planning and controlling components. So from a planning point of view, it provides a roadmap of what your intended journey is, or the results that you want to, the outcomes that you want to achieve. With the control aspect, a budget can provide you the baseline to compare your actual performance to that planned performance. We talked about variance reports a little bit earlier in these sessions. So along with that, we talked about various budgeting approaches. Expense-based budgeting, which typically organizations start out with, and as they go into the growth stage of their life cycle, oftentimes it's expense-based. And later in growth and into maturity, mature organizations switch to more of an income-based approach where you're looking at the money coming in and budgeting based on what you're going to take in rather than just the expense side. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So today we're going to talk about sustainability. And sustainability is a pretty broad concept. We think of it in terms of financial sustainability, but there's really more to it than just the financial side. And what Brad and I wanted to try to introduce are some of the different aspects to think about when you think about sustainability. And then we've got a few basic ratios that we'll share with you from the financial perspective, but we wanted to talk about sustainability in a broader sense. So there's a book called the Nonprofit Sustainability, Nonprofit Sustainability, Making Strategic Decisions for Financial Viability. It looks like this. And there's a companion book that looks like this that's called Sustainability Mindset. And they have a matrix map. But the authors of this book, the original book, one of the three authors, Steve Zimmerman, will be in Kosciuszko County. I think it's October 24th. The Community Foundation Kosciuszko County is offering a sustainability workshop for their community. And I've talked to Brad a little bit about it, and I think that the Community Foundation Noble County is going to look into it if we want to do a deeper dive in the future on this topic of sustainability. But I bring this up because I like their framework for sustainability, because they talk about it being an orientation that encompasses both financial sustainability and programmatic sustainability. So by financial sustainability, meaning the ability to generate resources to meet the needs of the present without compromising the future. And from a programmatic sustainability point of view, they're talking about the ability to develop, mature, and cycle out programs to be responsive to your constituencies over time. So sustainability is really about taking both of those into consideration. If you go to the next slide, please. A component that Brad and I wanted to add to the thinking as we're thinking about sustainability is the question of how long should your organization be sustained? And the reason why we ask this, if you'll go to the next slide, please, is that when you look at it from the Drucker point of view, that the nonprofit exists to bring about a change in individuals and society, there are two buckets of organizations, or at least social issues, that organizations try to address. And so what we want to introduce is the idea that if your organization exists to bring about a change that addresses a societal issue that should be eliminated, then you should work from a non-permanent mindset. So societal issues like teen pregnancy, addiction, disease, homelessness, these are societal issues that we would like to see go away. And so the mindset should be one of non-permanent, because if we're successful in bringing about our change, then there won't be a need for us in the future, okay? The other type if you exist to bring about a change that addresses a social issue, a societal issue that cannot be eliminated, then you should work from a permanent mindset. So education, healthcare, faith, fitness, these are all societal issues that you're always going to have another generation. You're always going to have that next generation, and you're trying to help them grow and develop in positive ways. So a more permanent mindset in that situation makes sense. Now, this is meant to be viewed from a 30,000-foot level and to promote organizational introspection. There are no absolutes. We're not saying that, you know, if your organization's working on homelessness, that you should not exist in X number of years. We're saying that in your thinking, and when you think about sustainability, if you think about it from that lens, how might you make different choices? You know, do we need our own facility long term? And questions like that in terms of your assets. Any questions on that before I move on? Or any comments? Okay, not hearing any. Again, these are just mindsets to bring to the table. So financial sustainability is a product of connecting with interested stakeholders, you know, who has an interest in your cause, and how do you connect with them? Demonstrating you're a well-run organization. So, you know, success attracts resources. So consistent revenue streams and predictable expenditures are a financial focus on being that well-run organization. Did we have a question pop up?
Yeah, we did, Tom. Neil asks, even though issues like teen pregnancy, addiction, disease, et cetera, are things we want to eliminate, they never will. So why wouldn't we operate with a permanent mindset?
Yeah, it's good. That's a great question. And so it's a slight tweak in thinking. And that is, you know, even though those issues will probably always exist, do we want to shift our focus internally to build our organization for permanency and kind of take our attention away from figuring out how do we eliminate those issues? And that's part of what makes you run the risk of becoming about the programming that you run and not necessarily about the change that you exist to bring about. Does that make sense, Neil, or do you have a follow-up there?
Yeah, I agree. I was just reflecting on the fact that, you know, these issues keep coming up with new people all the time, so that they, you know, even though you may eliminate the problem for one person, there's going to be another person and another person. And so the issue keeps on going on and on and on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. And again, it's not to say that you should be out of business in so much time. It's more of a question of how would it change your approach and your thinking if you thought about it in terms of, hey, can this be eliminated? Now, the other thing to it is no one organization is going to eliminate these issues on their own. And this is why collaboration is necessary in our sector, is because I'm working on part of it, somebody else is working on part of it, somebody else is working on part of it. And to the extent that we can all work together, you know, that's where we're going to make progress to truly eliminate it if it can be in our communities. We're not going to do it by ourselves. Okay?
Yep.
Yeah, great comment. Thank you. The last thing then on the being a product of is how well you tell your story. So that balance between mission-driven and effective use of resources, which we talked about a little bit earlier in the sessions. Next slide, please. So the question of how long should you be sustained, what we would direct you to is to revisit your purpose. You know, what change does your organization exist to bring about? Should your organization approach the issue with a non-permanent mindset or a permanent mindset? You know, why is this change important for the individual and society? You know, if you can, it's sometimes easier to identify the issue that needs to be addressed, but then to flip it and say, you know, how would life be better if this issue didn't exist? How would, what would it mean for us as a society if we were really able to tackle this? We don't always go as deep into that question, but if you do go a little deeper in that question, that's where you start to understand the value of what you're doing, the value of the outcome if you're successful. And that's important because that's good. That's an important piece when you talk about attracting resources. Next, you know, what is our role in bringing about that change? I'm sorry, Marguerite, I'm still in that. Thank you. What is our role in bringing about that change? Again, this goes back to what I just said earlier about usually, I mean, we're not going to do it by ourselves as an individual organization. It takes multiple groups and collaboration. So what is our role in that collaboration? And then who else is working on the change and what's their role? And then do the programs we offer effectively address the change within our role? So now you start to look into your programming. Once you have an understanding of landscape and who else is involved in what they're doing, then you can look at your programming and say, okay, based on what we understand about our role, is what we're doing, the programming we're offering, effectively addressing the change. Now you can go to the next slide, Margarita. So when you start looking at this level, then it's the question is, you know, what is the value in economic terms of that contribution that we bring to the change? You know, questions like who benefits economically from the change and by how much? So how are the participants different? And what's the economic value for them, if possible? Now, this isn't necessarily an easy thing to do, but if possible, how are they better off and what is that worth from an economic point of view? The community level beneficiaries, you know, as you start to talk about society, you know, who else benefits from that? And then funding sources that are interested in addressing that particular change. Who's out there, like a DECO Foundation, like a Community Foundation of Noble County, that has expressed an interest in this area? And what might I be able to present to them based on those interests that they have? That the reason for economic terms and that value is because we're trying to get it back to the financial side of things. In the end, you need financial resources. So the more we can demonstrate our value in terms of economic gain of some way, shape, or form, the easier it will be to justify the resources that we're asking for. Let me stop right there and see if there are any questions or comments.
I don't see any right now, Tom.
Okay. All right. So from there, then your answers will point to potential revenue streams. Which of those streams are most likely to be consistent sources of revenue? Because that's part of what we're after, right? Is consistency. And then how much influence do we have over each resource? So, you know, if we're looking at fee for service, for instance, we have a lot more control over fee for service because we can control the quality of what we're offering than we do, say, a government grant that's being offered for one time. That we would have, it would be a less consistent source and we would have less influence over it. Okay, so we're looking for consistency and influence. And then the other side of it, that's on the revenue side. On the other side of it, the expenses are the one area that you have nearly total control over. And I know you don't have control over things like price, but you do have control over things like the use of those resources. How much of it? What are my alternatives? What other things might I be able to do? So that, and I put in there nearly total control on purpose to maybe raise some eyebrows, but you really have to think from a 7 Habits point of view in terms of your circle of influence. When it comes to our expenses, they fall within our circle of influence for the most part. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking down at the little dot to make sure it was still mine. Didn't notice it had changed. So, you know, how will we sustain it? This is where program-based budgeting helps you understand which activities are consuming resources and how much. So when we talk about breaking it down into the programming side. So another concept that we wanted to introduce here is the idea that every action that you take either creates impact or it supports impact. Okay, and what we mean by this is you have actions that you take in your organization that directly bring about the change that you're intended to bring about. And then you have actions that don't directly bring about it, but maybe they're necessary to support your ability to bring about that change. Okay, so in Education Inc., our example, they have classes and certifications that they offer. So the financial resources that they use to secure and provide instructors in those classes is an example of an expense that creates a direct impact. The accounting that they pay for in order for the organization to know its financial standing and to track its financial standing does not directly impact the change that they're trying to bring about in individuals, but it's a supporting activity so that they can bring about that change. Okay, is that example okay for folks to wrap their minds around? So what we're suggesting here is that in your effort, you want to try to increase your organization's ability to direct resources towards activities that create impact. So how do we direct more financial resources to offering classes, offering certifications, and the things that will directly impact our ability to do that? And how do we minimize the resources being consumed by those things that support the impact? Not lose their quality, but how might we do it in a more efficient way so that we can redirect more resources toward those things that have a direct impact? Because remember, we're talking about sustainability. So the more we can direct resources towards things that are going to create impact, that's going to attract more interest and more support. But if we're heavily loaded on those things that just support the impact, a lot of times that can be viewed as money being wasted because it's not going directly to programming. So again, this is a mindset thing. How do we increase our ability to direct more towards creating impact and minimize that which is going to supporting impact? I'm going to stop again there to see if anybody has any questions or comments on that concept.
Feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions for Brad and Tom.
Oh, yeah, or just comments. Okay,
The only thing that I would, sorry, Tom.
yeah, go ahead, Sean.
The only thing that I would think that, this is all really great information. So I can see how this would also, again, going back to your 990, when you have those functional expenses, that programming side, the administrative and the fundraising side, if someone's really looking at those 990s, they're going to see the impact work based on how much is in the programming side versus your admin and your fundraising. And so, and I would think that, as an organization, when the boards are reviewing those 990s and they're looking at those numbers, they can see, okay, yeah, we can see that we're getting quality impact done. But I think it takes a lot, like you said, to plan for that, because if you're being really strategic and making sure that you're relevant and you're being sustainable, like you really have to focus on where those program dollars are at, expenses and income.
What was that?
I said those are just my thoughts, just for income and expenses. That's just critical, I guess.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, Sean, and you're exactly right. And as you know, there are third-party organizations that are looking more closely at nonprofits and where's the money going and things like that. So, and they're focused on things like how much of it goes to programming. The information's out there, And it's information we can use for ourselves too.
Right. And
Yeah.
I think it's also relevant though to mention that we should not ever apologize for quality staff and for the quality amount, like the amount of staff that we need in order to make sure that we have true impact. So I think sometimes in the nonprofit world, we find ourselves like kind of like crouching down every time we show our budget because people automatically go straight to our payroll. They go straight to our staff. And those people are the ones that create impact. I mean, that is critical. And that's probably one of my biggest complaints. Every time we have to show budgets to people, like I've literally had donors who maybe they donate, I don't know, like $150 a year. Like, well, we won't donate more until we see your budget. I'm like, like for real, you know? And so, and I think that's probably my biggest thing for nonprofits is like, do not apologize for your payroll. Do not, that's not okay. Like, now I do agree with the efficiency. Like we're constantly looking at our staff time and making sure, are we being efficient? I do not want staff just standing around for no reason, you know, just shooting the, you know, whatever, but really making sure that we are doing the work that we're saying we're doing. So that's just my other two things, because that is huge when nonprofits are constantly having to feel like they have to apologize for their payroll.
That is not, oh, go ahead, somebody else.
That's right. I think the other thing that's really hard to show is, you know, for us and working with relationships, and it takes so much time to create a change when someone has been in generational poverty that, you know, people want to see these great big numbers. I want to see numbers go down, not up. You know, that's our, you know, our goal is not to get so many people so we can pat ourselves on the back and say, look how many people we helped. It's really hard to show the relationship building, and those stories really take some time to come out. So I think that's one of the hardest things to also get into a grant so that people understand, you know, we may not have 500 people coming through the door, but the people that are coming through the door are seeing some real change in their lives. So I think that's a hard thing too.
Yeah. No, that both of
Tom,
those.
I'll jump in here real quick.
Oh, go ahead.
No, Angie and Sean, you guys are bringing up great points. And that's also why, as we went through this whole series, we tried to talk about the importance of your storytelling. And by reflecting on all this, is, you know, in this presentation, we talk about revisiting your purpose as you talk about how you want to move forward. And so you guys are hitting on those key facts of, you know, by your storytelling and by always talking about the change that you're working towards is what makes it much easier to explain as you talk with public or donors or other stakeholders. And so I think it's great that you guys have those perspectives, because you're right on target.
Yeah, thank you for that, Brad. That's where I was going to go with it too, is, you know, as a funder, I don't know the societal issues as well as all of you who are doing the work. And so a lot of times it's a disconnect between my understanding and what, you know, it takes, or what the situation is, or what's happening. And so use that to your advantage. You know, what we're suggesting are ways of thinking to be able to demonstrate the value you bring to the table as you tell that story, you know, and help us understand the story. Because it's easy to sit here and think, well, you know, if we're doing good work, we should just have less people in poverty. Well, there's a little more to it than just that, right? Just looking at that number that the government publishes each year, or something like that, a percentage of people in poverty. You know, things like transitional poverty were eye-opening for me in understanding what's going on. You know, so yeah, definitely to Brad's point, you know the story, how might you tell it? But in carrying out that story, what we're trying to provide are, like I said, we keep using mindsets or ways of thinking. You have to decide if these work for you or if they don't work for you. But even Sean's comment about the efficiency side of it, you know, I would look for effectiveness, not just efficiency. You know, because in effectiveness, you're getting great results and you're doing it in a more efficient manner. And that's a story that you can tell and that you can show that demonstrates the value, that we talk about these high quality individuals that we have. Well, let's demonstrate their value. Here's what they're doing to help us, be more effective in our work. And that's all part of your story. Great points. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, so to just break it down a little further then, when we look at our programming, we want to know if we can answer certain questions. How much does it cost to provide this service? And how much staff time is consumed to provide this service? And some people do time studies and things like that to get a baseline. But really, I'll go back to Sean's comment about high quality people. It's really gaining an understanding of what these folks are doing on a day-to-day basis and what the value of that activity is. And then many are wearing multiple hats. So they're impacting different areas of support throughout the organization or direct programming. And we just want to be able to tell those stories. But it's through the understanding of these things that it allows us to be able to do that. Okay. Go ahead to the next slide, please.
All righty. I'll give Tom a break here, let him get some water in himself. We will kind of changing the mindset here too, because we're going to start talking a little bit about math. So please don't turn off your screens. We talked about telling your story, but now these are hopefully going to give you some of the things that you can use to show or how you get a better understanding of the financial health of your organization. And so we're going to talk about some financial ratios that can serve as these indicators of your organization's financial health. Through the IPA, which is the Indiana Philanthropy Alliance, they have a formula that they use that is just their sustainability number, which is your sustainable revenue divided by your operating expenses. And so it's a very straightforward ratio. If it's greater than 1, you're deemed to be sustainable, because that means that you are bringing in enough revenue to cover your expenses each year. Less than 1 means that you can still be a continuing organization, but you need additional fundraising or other support or maybe credit from a lending institution in order to continue to provide your services. We're going to really highlight these more in the case study. So we'll get you a little bit more detail there, but things to think about here with sustainable revenue. These are, once again, as Tom was talking about with the expenses, these are the revenues that you have some control over. These are the revenues that you can count on. And so these are your fees for service, but they're not necessarily, as he said, government grants, that maybe are only once every 3 years and things like that. So as you look at your budget and you're figuring out that formula, you have to identify what are those sustainable revenues as you calculate this ratio. Another one is an impact support ratio. And so this is where you look at your expenses related with your programming. Your programs are where you create impact, and then you divide that by your total expenses for the organization. And this is going to give you some ratio between 0 and 100%. And so we'll talk about more about that, but there really isn't a magic number for this. This is a discussion number for you and your organization on where you think that ratio should be. Some banking ones here are current ratio, and this is related to your current assets and current liabilities. This is the idea of how can we pay for our current expenses? Do we have the funds available in the short term to cover our short-term expenses? So that's what the current ratio is. And another one along those lines is your days in cash. This is saying that with the cash we have in our checkbook, how many days worth of expenses could we cover with that amount of cash? So when you see this formula, you're going to see us talking about your average daily expense, and we're going to divide that into your total cash that you have on your balance sheet. So those are some of those ratios that are meant to be to help you show or demonstrate your sustainability. Like I said, our case studies focus on these things, so we hopefully can answer some questions or have further discussion when we talk about those, but just kind of wanted to introduce those ratios. Margarita? So how can we progress towards sustainability? The first thing is it's a crock pot, not a microwave. It's going to be a process. It's not something that happens overnight. Okay, so you need to make annual progress towards it. It's also the tortoise and the hare, the story there. It's about plodding along consistently. And so, but it's also not haphazardly done. Okay, this is done through your budgeting. You plan on this process. And so as we talked about, as you grow as an organization through the nonprofit life cycle, you go, from when you're a startup, you're just, you're using your checkbook as your financial statements. Basically, do I have enough in the checkbook to keep going? As you begin to grow, you start to bring in more resources, but you're also starting to provide more programming. So you're going to become more sustainable, hopefully through that growth. And then as you level into maturity, then you can really start to think about that long-term sustainability of your organization. And so, and as I said there, that evolution of budgeting, hopefully you'll start to be able to create a cash reserve. So start to build that rainy day fund, with surpluses from previous years. But it's important that you be intentional about putting an annual amount in there, one that you can sustain, but you want to make sure you have a target of what you're trying to reach. You don't want it to have it be, well, whatever's left over, we'll move over to the cash reserve, because if you start doing that, you will spend it before you realize you've spent it. You've got to make sure that that is something that you've planned at the beginning of the year. And if it's available, then you're using it at the end of the year for that purpose. Another way you can do it is to create a capital repair or replacement fund. A lot of you on your financial statements probably have a line of depreciation expense that is included there. A lot of times that's considered a non-cash expense, meaning that even though you put it on your financial statement, you're really not putting that money into the depreciation account, most likely, especially when you're starting out. So once you can put that money in there, that's where it would go. You start to fund depreciation, or you start to implement a replacement schedule. With every AC unit or furnace, they all have a roof. They all have a lifetime to them. And so when you start to be sustainable, then you can start to put funds in there to help pay for that. Let's see here. Is there a percentage that Sean left a question in here saying, is there a percentage that becomes alarming to funders, meaning the funders choose not to provide funding because the reserves are too low? I'm assuming you meant to say too low. Too high. I see you're too sustainable is what you're saying. Go ahead, Tom, if you have something to jump in there.
No, I was laughing because it was the reverse. That's all.
And just to give you some context, Brad, I can tell you this organization before I took over, like the reserves are pretty high, and they actually had some funders that said, hey, we're not going to give you funding because you have too much in reserves. And so then they stopped essentially fundraising when it was all said and done, and they started spending money out of their reserves, which got them into a whole lot of a big mess that I had to clean up when I came on. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, they apparently had funders saying, oh, you have too much in reserves. And I've heard that from some other colleagues that that's what they've been told. So I'm just wondering, is there a certain percentage, like rule of thumb with that?
I am not aware of a rule of thumb, and I'm going to defer to Tom, thankfully, since he unmuted himself with a little more experience here, but then I'll share some thoughts after he's done.
Well, I can't speak for every funder, of course, but I mean, from my perspective, if I see that there's a large amount of reserve and you're asking for funding, one of the natural questions is, if you have the money to do it, why are you asking for funding from me? And so having an explanation as to why you're carrying that large reserve is part of telling your story. You know, so I think Sean, you talked about how they started spending it down and then it created trouble. Well, that led to them understanding why they had a reserve, right? Because the trouble was created when it was spent down. So I think being able to tell that story is what's important. I don't know how strict everybody is, but I know that we're open-minded enough to say, hey, if you've got a good explanation of why you need that size of reserve, then we're willing to hear that, because more times than not, you come across organizations who do not have a reserve. And so to see one with a reserve, it's kind of impressive that they've been able to get to that point. So then it's just a matter of saying, okay, here's why we have a reserve at this level. Now, part of that telling the story is be sure that you can tell your story from the point of view of what's reasonable. You know, some people have a reserve that's so high because they're preparing for the absolute worst possible thing that could happen. And then you have to ask yourself, well, is it reasonable that that's going to happen? Are they just being overcautious? So finding that balance, what's a reasonable story, is what I would be looking for, what we would look for at the DECO Foundation. But I can't speak for everybody else.
I think the other thing that comes to my mind is that, you know, what is the purpose of the request? Is it about a new program that you're looking to start in your organization? Or are you asking just for operational support? You know, are you asking to help keep the lights on or something like, you know, so, you know, if the request kind of implies that you're not able to meet your current needs, then you have a reserve fund. The conversation would be what is the relationship there? If it's the idea that, hey, we got this new program we're looking to start, it's going to be new things coming on board and things like that. And we don't know the whole impact of what it's going to be. You know, we could do some support getting it off the ground. I think that's still a reasonable request that you're putting out there. So, but to build on Tom's conversation too, it's just a matter of explaining everything to the funders that you're talking to, and hopefully the funders take the time to listen to you. And get to know you, and that, you know, all part of relationship building that way also. Angie, you put some comments in there. Do you mind taking the time just to kind of share it verbally too?
Sure. A few years ago, we were defunded by an organization that said that we had too much in reserve, when what they were actually looking at was money that was designated for direct ministry. We were not seeking money for that particular program. That was not something that we could pull out of there. Obviously, it was designated. So the grant team didn't have a full understanding of what that money was to begin with, and that we couldn't use it anywhere else. So that was, and it was frustrating for me knowing that we were building towards sustainability. And it was sort of my first encounter with, we've worked really hard, come from having no money pretty much when I started in this and cleaning up things too. Now we have some money in reserve, but now you're going to lose a funder because you have money in reserve. So it was my first encounter with that. It was very frustrating. It was very frustrating. And I will say that some funders are really, really awesome. We just added capital repair and replacement to our budget this year. And I went for a grant to help us fund that. We did a depreciation schedule for every piece of equipment in our building. We came up with a reasonable percentage to start with. We presented that to them and said, can you help us fund this for the first year while we get our feet under us and how we're going to go about this going forward? And they funded the whole thing for us for the first year. So it was pretty amazing that they saw that as a forward motion and were able to, they stepped forward with something that was a little bit of an unusual request.
That's great.
No, I appreciate that. Any other thoughts or comments to follow up?
Hey, I was just going to say to Angie's point about capital repair and replacement, that's another demonstration that you've got a handle on your organization, and there's a steadiness to it that we were talking about before, and that makes the risk side of making an investment in your organization lower. because you can see that the organization's working more forward thinking and so forth. So good for you.
All right, Margarita. So we started talking about this in terms of our tools. We approached the reserve fund, and we said that can come in many different ways. Cash flows, funding depreciation. One we didn't touch on though is planned growth. As your organizations, we talked about going from startup to growth to maturity. More than likely, your organizational staff is going to be growing as your organization grows. And so you want to think ahead. You want to have an idea in your head that as, not only just next year, but let's say in 3 years from now, what do we envision? Do we think we'll need new staff members in 2 years? Will we need a new staff member? Well, that's tough to budget for in 1 year. And so if you anticipate staff members coming on board, you want to start to plan for that growth. And that's another use of that reserve fund, is that you identify what staff are we bringing on, what's the anticipated cost, and how can we start building up to that? Okay. This is also where you need to also think about, especially if it's programming staff, what kind of revenues will be associated with that. And that can help you in your budgeting process to know, okay, maybe this staff will pay for itself right away because of the new programming we'll be able to do. And so we don't need as much of a reserve to help bring that into our budget. And that's where you'll hear people talk about the fancy term of pro forma. Basically, it's just that predictor or projection of, as I think about new programming staff coming in, I predict what the expense of that's going to be and the revenue associated with it. And this is, talking about that conversation with Sean of looking for funding for something like that. And Angie brought it up. This first year, we need a little help getting our reserve started and getting getting our feet and getting ready for it. And in your pro forma, you're going to need $5,000 or $10,000 that first year in order to help get that going. That could be something that funders could help out with and share your story that way, knowing that in year 2, we're good. We're going to see this growth, and in year 2, we're good. We just need this initial startup support in order to get there. But you want to plan for that growth, so always be thinking about where your organization is headed to, so you can anticipate those additional funds that you'll need down the road. Some of your organizations may conduct an annual campaign. This is a little different. I view an annual campaign a little different in a sense that it's not event-based. For me, an annual campaign is simply connecting with your donors. Generally, you'll have an annual donor group that gives, and that's your annual campaign. It's not those that participate in a golf tournament. Now, those people could be turned into people in your annual campaign, but generally an annual campaign doesn't have an event associated with it, in my opinion. Tom or others, if you have a different opinion there. So it's a form of fundraising, not the only form of fundraising, I guess is the way I want to say it. And for those of you, as we went through COVID last year and once again this year, your annual campaign is outside of those events. And so you can still have fundraising going on even when you can't have an event. So that's why there's a lot of value to an annual campaign in part of your process. And then lastly, endowments. Okay, this is where you are creating that long-term sustainability through a permanent endowment to support your organization. And the thing that I put here is planned giving. Really what you'll see is that the biggest increases in endowments come from planned gifts from donors, estate gifts, charitable remainder trusts. It's not usually going to come from $100 donations over the years. Your endowments come out of those unexpected gifts most commonly. So that's why planned giving is such an important part of this process. Any questions on those tools? Okay. Go ahead, Margarita. Oh, sorry. The other thing, capital campaigns here. All of us have, if you're building, you're going to get a new building or you're doing some renovations in your building and you're going to be expanding the size of it. make sure in your capital campaigns, you're not just looking to cover the cost of the actual construction. If everything that you build is at some point in time going to have an expense associated with it. If it's a building, it's going to need a roof in 10, 15 years, you know? So you need to make sure that if it's a $500,000 construction project, your capital campaign probably better be $750,000 or $1 million. Okay, so that you are incorporating those maintenance funds or those anticipated, you know, operating costs are going to go up. If you've increased the square footage of your building, the cost to heat and cool it is going to go. So your costs each month are going to increase as part of these things. So make sure that when you design your capital campaigns, it's more than just the cost of construction. You know, you want to have that future thinking. All right, next. The last thing I want to share before we get to the case studies here is talking about succession planning. Sustainability, we've talked about so much, is your purpose, it's the financials, but it's also, as we pointed out, the importance of your staff. And staff is going to change over time. And so you need to make sure that you're putting things in place so that once one person leaves, whether it's a staff member or the director, there's a plan in place for the organization to move forward. Okay, so as it says here, a succession organization identify, recruits, trains, and retains star employees. They're always building their bench. They're hiring great employees to come up through the organization and maybe be the next future leader there. So it's important that you're always thinking, you know, once again, planning ahead. Have that next person there. I like Sean mentioned, make sure you don't have a flat organizational chart. Yep, you want to have steps to it, okay? Because your employees will appreciate that too, to know that there are ways that they can progress through the organization. So those are great things to do there. So just wanted to touch on that a little bit too, is that as we talk about growing our staff, you want to make sure that you have that succession plan in place for your organization also. All right, let's talk about the case studies. You can go ahead too, Margarita. Oh, you know what, Tom, that went like what happened to our thing. Let me see if I can get it here real quick. Talk amongst yourselves, Tom, for a little bit while I work on something.
Okay, Brad's going to try to pull up the case study numbers so that we can see those 4 financial ratios that we pointed out. And then in preparation for that, I would say if I were in the financial sector full-time, I would be a finance person, not an accountant, okay? And so when you look at ratios and things like that, that's what I'm into. How you get the numbers to populate all that and keep track of it, somebody else can do. So I really like ratios. And the thing that I would say is as you grow and mature as an organization, there are different ratios that will be more important as you go along. One we brought up earlier, days in cash, in a startup situation and early on as in your organization, that may be something that you keep track of quite a bit to know, you know, how many more days can we operate? And as you get more and more mature as an organization, you may start to change to something more like the impact ratio, where you start to figure out, you know, how much of our resources are going towards those things that will impact. And so these are just 4 that Brad and I kind of talked about and came up with because we thought they were applicable. There are other ratios that you may come up with or other resources that have more defined ratios that will be attractive to you. It's just a matter of where's my organization in terms of its development and what information is important for me to keep an eye on and see if we're moving the needle. So the first one is this the first one?
Well, we just due to time, I'm going to highlight just 2 of them.
Hey, Brad,
okay.
you want to remove your chat box?
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to, but I'm kind of stuck in there. So is it covering stuff? Is it?
Well, it just makes it small, but that's okay. I'll work through it here. So the impact to support ratio is one that we we've dubbed this, we've named it. But basically what you're doing is you're looking at your program expenses as a percent of your total expenses. And so in our Education Inc. example, if you look down at the bottom where it's highlighted, we simply took the expenses related to certifications and general classes, because we saw those as direct impact, added them together, and then divided them by the total expenses in the left-hand column. And it put us at 73.3%. And so, one of the questions is, well, is this the right percentage? And this goes back to our earlier conversation about the reserve fund. How much reserve should you have? Well, what percentage of your expenses should be directly impacting your change? Well, that depends on the organization's story. As a foundation, I'll give you an example. We carry more staff than some other foundations our size. We also carry less staff than other foundations our size. But if you ask, well, why do you carry more staff? And the answer is because the geographic areas that we serve, 13 rural counties, 4 different states, we need to build relationships with people in those communities, because we're going to be funding the same organizations, or a high percentage of the same organization, over and over again for various things, because there are only so many organizations in those counties. So it's important for us to have staff that can go and travel and be out there and connect with people. And that's why we do generally an in-person follow-up, or at least on the phone, with proposals that we receive. And it's partly by design. Could we do grant making with fewer admin resources? Yeah, we could. But philosophically, it doesn't make sense for us to do that. So it's the same thing for your organization. Whatever that number turns out to be, is it the right percentage? Well, what's your philosophy? What is it that you're trying to achieve? That needs to go into the thinking of what's the right percentage of impact to support.
And this is kind of what Sean was referencing when she talked about organizations looking at your 990s and how they break down your spending there. This would be the type of ratio that they could determine from that information. I'm going to see if I can get this to switch over and then reshare. Hopefully now you can see the IPA ratio screen. Okay, so this is that ratio that we talked about, where it's sustainable revenue versus operating expense. The key, if you remember up here, the total income for Education Inc. was $630,500, and the expenses were $630,256. So they showed actually a surplus for their budget. But the thing we have to remember with this formula, we're looking at sustainable income, and a significant portion of their monies, their income is grants. I think it was in $240,000 in grants is what that was. And so you really can't consider grant income sustainable revenue. It's dangerous to do so because you never know if the grant funding is always going to be there. So for this one here, the IPA ratio is $380,500 divided by the $630,256. And so it's just 60%, 60.4%. So that means that they're going to have to do fundraising, an annual campaign, get work for grants, or take credit in order to keep the organization flowing. So this one is in terms of ratios, this one is one you want to get to 100 or over 100. Okay, this is one we know where we want it to go. So you need to work on ways to do that. That's one thing, getting more fee for service, working on other sources of revenue. Maybe down the road you get a gift, a planned giving gift that gets an endowment started for you. Endowment income is pretty dependable. And so you could work with that as a way to improve your sustainability. So that was just kind of an example there to make sure that you understand the difference between sustainable revenue and all your revenues. So make sure you clarify that as you look at your own financial statements. I'm going to stop sharing here because we hit the 10 o'clock hour and offer the opportunity for anybody to ask any other follow-up questions or comments that they'd like to share in closing.
Well, thank you, Tom and Brad,
It-
for all your
it-
work. Go ahead, Tom.
Marguerite, I just, at the end there, Sean put diversify, diversify, diversify. And that's important as a strategy because it reduces risk. If one of your funding streams would go away, it may hurt, but it won't cripple your organization. So good comment, Sean. Thank you.
Absolutely. And like I said, thank you, Tom and Brad, for this series. If anybody has any questions on sustainability, I'm sure Tom and Brad would be more than happy to come chat with you and your board and see if they can answer any of your questions. As I said earlier, our next series in this is going to be grant writing, and it starts October 14th. So if you're not signed up for that, you'll want to get signed up for that. And you can go to the Community Foundation website at www.cfnoble.org and then scroll to the bottom of the page to be able to register for that series. You will get the video for this either later today or tomorrow and the survey to respond to. I appreciate your time today and we'll see you on October 14th.
I will also
Thank
let
you
you
all.
know that I'm going to get Margarita an updated presentation with those case study slides in it. So we'll get that included with the survey link email.
Thank you.